everyone in the room, our colleagues from Griffith University, the University of Queensland and the University of the Sunshine Coast, and also a big welcome to our online audience who are viewing us through the camera over here. So I will be looking at our face-to-face audience. I'll also be pivoting over to our online audience too from time to time. My name is Associate Professor Leonie Loxton-Binnie. It's lovely to see our face-to-face colleagues, but also to welcome our online colleagues as well. So we hope you will enjoy today's session. We have the great privilege today to be joined by Professor James Hyam from the University of Otago, who is very shortly waiting to come online and speak to us. James will be talking to us about the topic of sustainable tourism development in the post-COVID era. So we're looking forward to hearing, of course, James' insights. Before I hand over to James, just a very brief bio. As always, with someone who is, of course, quite senior, it's always very difficult to capture their, I suppose, key achievements in a very short time frame. But I will hand over to James, and just to highlight that he is a professor at the University of Otago. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Stavanger in Norway. Relating back to colleagues within the room, he's also been a James White Fellow at the University of Queensland. And he researches on a range of topics, including climate change and also sport tourism. And also for our colleagues in the room, I thought I would highlight just some of our colleagues he has worked with here at Griffith, also at the University of, at Queensland University. So he's worked with Gabby and Lisa on altering attitudes towards flying. Up the back, he's worked with Brent, I understand, with sport and sustainable tourism destinations. And I don't think he's with us today, but Brent. So Brent was actually supervised by James. So I think just to think about the great capacity of how many students James has supervised who have actually gone on and have very senior roles at a number of universities around the world. So that is my introduction to James. I will hand over and I will just move over to the side. After his presentation, we will have some questions, of course. For those of you in the room, if you are asking a question, if you can be very clear, introduce yourself, be clear in your question. For those online, you will also have the opportunity to provide questions via the chat. So thank you very much. Thank you, James. I will hand over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the generous introduction. It's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's amazing to be able to speak to this audience and to the audience virtually connecting today without leaving my, well, almost literally without leaving my front doorstep. I was thinking just before, the carbon cost of my presentation today equates to me riding my bicycle to work, and that's pretty much zero. Kia ora koutou, ko James Hyam toku ingoa, no rānana oku tipuna, ke te noho au, ke Ōtepoti. I've just introduced myself as James Hyam. My ancestors arrived in Aotearoa from London, namely my parents, and I live in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. As I say, thank you for this opportunity to offer my thoughts on sustainable tourism after COVID-19. This is a very timely conversation. Tourism is reopening, but it seems that a lot of us do not necessarily want to return to the old pre-COVID tourism. And there's a sense of urgency surrounding the need for a new tourism, a more sustainable, a more climate-friendly 21st century ready tourism. So the importance of this fork in the road cannot really be overstated. Of course, I'm coming to you from across the ditch, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I promise not to mention the cricket overnight. I've been given this brief to briefly talk about the challenges that we were facing in New Zealand tourism before and during COVID, some of the policy initiatives that are now aiming to transform New Zealand tourism, and some lessons learned from some of our insights in this corner of the globe. and possibly some comments on implications for tourism research and education. I want to do this in a reasonably freewheeling way. I'll keep a close eye on the time and make this reasonably unstructured. The situation that we face at the moment and the gravity of the crisis, the magnitude of the challenges, the magnitude of the opportunities that we face currently are very difficult to overstate. And this UN WTO chart really sums it up. From 1998, this almost relentless growth in global tourism through to the end of 2019. This chart, of course, includes 9/11, it includes the SARS epidemic, it includes the GFC, but nothing compares to COVID. This 74% crash in global tourism, this 1.1 billion tourist cliff face with COVID-19 is absolutely unprecedented. International arrivals to New Zealand look similar to the heart monitor in an ER room when the heartbeat stops. This crashing to zero and flatlining with this unprecedented closure of our international borders. So the key question is, what happens next? The UN WTO is pretty clear on one thing, and that is that we will return to pre-COVID levels. The only question, it seems, is how quickly. This chart shows the potential scenarios 1, 2, and 3. They all converge around the idea that there will be a rapid rebound. Similar recovery scenarios are expected in New Zealand. The return of international travellers is beginning with the opening of the Trans-Tasman bubble. We now have quarantine-free travel in both directions with the Cook Islands. Our borders are slowly and quite tenuously reopening. Wellington today went into lockdown level 2 after a COVID case arrived from across the Tasman. Many in this country feel that mass vaccination should come before a return to tourism. But of course, there will be this progressive reopening of borders, and it's expected that from 2022, we will see a beginning of a return to tourism, international arrivals. Whether we'll return to up to 250, 300 plus thousand visitors a month into this country, or what that time frame will be is of course unknown. So we're living in very interesting times. Global tourism has been crippled by the pandemic. The WTTC focuses pretty exclusively on reopening borders, restoring tourism, accelerating the recovery, returning to continued high growth in global tourism. A lot of emphasis on livelihoods, employment, regional economic development. Obviously, the stakes are very high. Yet, having said that, the COVID tourism pause has actually come as a relief in some communities, some destinations. It's seen as a chance to take stock, to reflect and think about our lives, our communities, and our experiences of tourism as hosts, and perhaps also as tourists. We all know the power of tourism, the potential power of tourism as a force for good. We know that tourism under certain conditions can promote peace and understanding and address issues of injustice. It can educate and raise awareness. It can revive Indigenous cultures, Indigenous languages. It can empower women. It can save endangered species. It can lift people out of poverty. These are all very good things, of course. No one questions how good these things are. Tourism can be a very powerful, positive force. However, equally, under certain conditions, tourism, as we know, can be a very destructive force. It can be a driver of high carbon emissions. It can destroy the fabric of communities. It can commodify aspects of culture and destroy authentic experiences. It can treat captive animals unethically, and it can drive wild animal populations into local extinction if it's not really carefully managed. In the case of last chance tourism, it can squeeze the last drops of capitalist value out of endangered species, out of disappearing glaciers. So obviously it's a double-edged sword. This image from last week has become iconic. it is seen by many to symbolise the return of mass tourism, despite strong local objections. So we're at a fork in the road. The point that we had arrived at in Aotearoa, New Zealand, immediately pre-COVID, was comprehensively captured in this really important report. Pristine, popular, imperiled, ? This is the report of Simon Upton, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. The Parliamentary Commissioner's Office is an advisory to the New Zealand Government on matters of environmental sustainability. This report was released on the 18th of December 2019, about 10 days after the Whakaari White Island disaster and about 2 weeks before COVID was reported to the World Health Organization. In this report, Simon Upton claims that old tourism is imperiled because it was locked into capitalist volume growth, a volume growth paradigm. The pandemic has revealed beyond any doubt that tourism must radically change if it is to survive in the 21st century. At least that has been the subsequent conclusion drawn by Simon Upton. In his report, Simon Upton offers a very useful framework for considering the environmental impacts of tourism. As you can see here, starting from the left, we have high visitor numbers, or pre-COVID high visitor numbers, driven by the enormously successful 100% Pure New Zealand global marketing campaign. Those numbers drive visitor behaviours that have an environmental footprint that lead to tourism-related environmental pressures. Our approach to this has been to enact policies and management practices that manage impacts and mitigate damage. As you can see on the right here, system resilience is built through management policies. But the case that the Parliamentary Commissioner made is that you cannot continue hardening sites and building car parks and building toilets and increasing the scale of facilities to accommodate more people in natural areas indefinitely. You just can't do that without ultimately destroying the naturalness that attracted visitors in the first place. So in this framework, he calls for a rethink that recognises that at some point you must pay attention to the numbers of visitors entering the system, their behaviours, what they do, and the environmental costs of those activities. So subsequently, February the 18th, 2021, this follow-up report was released by the Parliamentary Commissioner. Not 100% pure, but 4 steps closer. It makes 4 important policy recommendations for government to consider. The recommendations in this report are built upon 3 key principles. The first is that tourism should be treated like any other sector of the economy. It should not be accorded special attention and public subsidy. It should not rely on local ratepayers to subsidise tourist facilities. It should not rely on national taxpayers to provide facilities for the use of international visitors. It should not be subsidised in these ways. Secondly, second key principle is that local communities and mana whenua, the local indigenous people, should be central to local tourism development. They should be a part of decision-making. They live with tourism. They should be a part of decision-making processes, which puts a lot of emphasis on our regional tourism organisations that historically have focused on destination marketing rather than destination management and consultation with local residents, local communities. And thirdly, tourists and tourist businesses should pay for the costs of the services, including the environmental services that they use and any impairments that they impose upon their environments. So the Parliamentary Commissioner argues in this report that COVID has provided a circuit breaker, and now is the moment to act upon concerns around long-standing issues that have been the cause of growing concerns in the years immediately prior to COVID. So what I want to do in this short presentation is offer a few moments of thought on a few issues that I've been involved in researching in recent years. This quote at the top of the slide I really like. It's from Rod Oram, who's a economist and media commentator in this country, who said last year, to thrive, the tourism sector needs to radically rethink its role in our natural environment, society, and economy. Its greatest opportunities lie in tackling its greatest liabilities. International aviation emissions are arguably our greatest liability. So the way that we think about jet setting around the world has changed. COVID has brought home to us the realization that our lives had accelerated to breaking point prior to COVID. That acceleration has been powered by cheap oil and high carbon mobility. These have been the drivers of mass tourism. Of course, transportation currently accounts for approximately 23% of total global energy-related carbon emissions. So it's a significant problem and a rapidly growing problem. Those emissions were forecast to double by 2050 prior to the COVID circuit breaker. So the global tourism system is dependent on high carbon transportation. Prior to COVID, tourists were traveling more frequently, traveling further, staying shorter, spending less per visit. And aviation, global aviation has continued to be missing in action when it comes to efforts to mitigate climate change. Airlines and airline manufacturers have been adamant that we're on a pathway to climatically sustainable aviation. They go to great pains to explain to us the energy efficiencies of jet aviation. This slide, courtesy of Paul Peters, is really informative. From top left to bottom right, we can see the diminishing efficiency gains in jet aviation through the decades, falling well short of the ICAO research target set in 2009 for 2020, and well short of climate safe aviation by 2050. So the argument here, of course, is that the jet engine has achieved its evolutionary sophistication. Further gains in efficiency have become smaller and harder to achieve. And on the graph here, from bottom left to top right, those efficiency gains have clearly been completely overwhelmed by massive growth in demand for air travel since 1970 in particular. This is a paper that we published in 2014. It examines the way in which airlines have been enormously successful in producing air travel as an institutionalized form of consumption. This has driven demand such that those who do fly now fly more and more, the frequent flyers. For them, air travel has moved from being extraordinary to pretty much an everyday activity, very much normalized, like jumping on a bus or driving a car. The airlines since 1970 have created over 100 million frequent flyers globally, yet it is estimated that over 90% of the global human population has never flown in an airplane. Now, thanks Qantas, even our pets can earn frequent flyer points. Qantas also has recently introduced to us the idea of flights to nowhere. So the injustices of air travel have become really glaring when so few high emitters and potentially their pets produce disproportionate emissions, driving climate change that will most impact the most vulnerable who never fly. So flight shame should come as no surprise. And this is a massive issue for New Zealand. We are geographically distant. We are dependent on aviation. Our international visitors fly an average of 10,000 kilometers just to get here. We are very, very vulnerable to flight shame. In 2019, we published this paper, which is a critique of tourist aviation emissions. We note in the paper that currently we rely solely on individual decisions to forego air travel for those who care enough about climate change as a means to reduce high-risk emissions. But we also argue in this paper that this approach cannot possibly succeed. We conclude in this paper that it is our moral duty to promote coordinated collective action to address this existential problem. This coincidentally, is precisely what the Parliamentary Commissioner has recommended in his follow-up report. He recommends a distance-based progressive tax. So the further you fly to get here, it's actually a departure tax. So the further you fly to go home, the more you pay. This is a tax that he proposes would be ring-fenced to support research into aviation biofuels, in particular, synthetic fuels, and to provide climate finance for our Pacific neighbours who are so threatened by climate change. There's been some argument that perhaps this could also be linked to length of stay. So the shorter you travel to get here and the longer you stay here, the less tax you pay. Details aside, it's really important that we take this recommendation seriously, because this is the elephant in the sky, so they say, when it comes to sustainable tourism in our corner of the globe. Liability 2, a second major liability in New Zealand tourism, relates to high carbon emissions produced, generating every dollar of tourist GDP. This paper, recently published, is a collaboration led by my colleague at UQ, Yayen Sun. We refer here to information asymmetry, which relates to, or at least tries to explain, the detailed attention historically that has been paid to measuring tourism's economic impacts, with almost complete neglect of the social, cultural, and environmental costs and benefits of tourism. The reality is that very few countries and very few regions within countries accurately measure or even attempt to measure and report their tourism carbon emissions. This is beginning to change, but belatedly. So in this paper, we present the first comprehensive analysis of the carbon footprint of tourism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We developed this model, which we call the Tourism Carbon Information System, highlighting the need for time series insights into the carbon emissions of tourism, carbon emissions per dollar GDP, and tourism's decarbonisation trajectory, all benchmarked against other sectors of the national economy. Yayen led an analysis of this in relation to tourism in this country. We found that tourism as a sector produces the largest energy-related carbon emissions in New Zealand. You can see here some of the key findings. Tourism carbon emissions per dollar GDP was 2.3 times higher than the national average across sectors. We were decarbonising, but not as quickly as other sectors of the New Zealand economy. And certainly with continued high growth in visitor arrivals, there was absolutely no prospect of us decarbonising tourism without intervention. Thirdly, another key interest of mine when it comes to sustainability research focuses on human tourist interactions with wild animal populations. Again, finding much room for improvement when it comes to sustainability. In 2015, we published this paper, myself with colleagues in marine science. In this paper, we challenged the previously uncontested notion that human interactions with marine mammals are non-consumptive, drawing on several years, several decades, in fact, of marine science research. We argue in this paper that wildlife interactions should be managed as a cause of sublethal anthropogenic stress. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it does cause stress. It may not kill these animals, but it does contribute to the health of individual and animal population, their well-being. In other words, you simply cannot keep adding more visitors to the wildlife encounter without ultimately destroying that focal animal population. This point is really nicely illustrated in a site that's very important and very close to where I live. This is Sandfly Bay on the Otago Peninsula. Some of you may have been there. My colleague here at Otago, Professor Phil Seddon in wildlife management, reported that in the 1990s, around 700 to 1,000 visitors came to Sandfly Bay. Most of them were local residents. They were spread reasonably evenly across the year. Since 2000, Sandfly Bay has become a prominent site on tourist social media as a place to see hoiho, yellow-eyed penguin, as pictured here, a place where you can go and see them for free. There's a very small population of hoiho on this beach. With increasing social media engagement, visitor numbers to Sandfly Bay accelerated from around 1,000 to 30,000 international visitors, mainly in the breeding season and the summer season, almost overnight. And the hoi-ho population has slowly but surely all but disappeared. The neighbouring beach, Boulder Beach nearby, which is closed to the public, the penguin population there has fared much better. This contrasts a really interesting kind of comparative case elsewhere on the Otago Peninsula. This is the case of korora, or little blue penguins, at the nearby Takiharuru Beach, Pilot's Beach. It's a very informative comparison. For many years, the blue penguin population at Pilot's Beach numbered about 8, 10, 12 breeding pairs. The population was barely viable due to predation, occasional vehicle strikes at night. On one occasion, a tourist was found with some live penguins that he had bundled into a sack in the boot of his car, stealing individual animals. The Pukekura Penguin Initiative of the local Korako Karatai Trust has completely transformed this population. There are now between 200 and 300 pairs of breeding penguins that can be viewed every evening at this beach in a very carefully managed, guided, fully interpreted experience at a fully protected site. It is supported by a science program that is fully funded by visitors themselves. It's completely transformed the site. This is insightful because it leads us to talk briefly about what we refer to as the emerging regenerative tourism paradigm. I refer here to some thinking that was presented at our tourism policy school in March this year by Professor Susanna Becken. So what is the regenerative tourism paradigm? This dovetails very nicely with Simon Upton's words and the need to move away from extractive or depletive old tourism, in which nature is produced and consumed according to capitalist principles. So we need to move away from this extractive, depletive paradigm. We have moved towards sustainable tourism, which offers a positive contribution in terms of raising awareness about tourism sustainability issues, limiting harm, minimizing the consumption of resources, recycling, reusing, and such like. But sustainable tourism remains anchored in the old tourism paradigm. Maybe some of our vanguard businesses leading a move towards restorative tourism. Some tourism businesses have embedded this approach really successfully. They're committed to repairing damage, to restoring ecologies. This is really, really creditworthy. They contribute to conservation actively through all sorts of avenues, including education and advocacy. Here, there's a case in the slide of Real Journeys, which assists forest and bird with predator control in Fiordland. They engage with Cancer Society volunteers to train them, building natural capital, building social capital. So this is really creditworthy, and it hints at a new alternative tourism paradigm that's now coming into focus. But regenerative tourism is perhaps the next step in this evolution. This is an emerging paradigm. It aspires to functional self-renewal. It's informed and inspired by Te Ao Māori and Maturanga Māori indigenous perspectives. It serves as a platform to understand ecological systems based on indigenous knowledge. And it adopts a long-term intergenerational perspective that sees humans as part of rather than separate from nature. This slide, again courtesy of Susanna, summarizes how tourism could potentially add to rather than detract from the four capitals. The four capitals, environmental, social, economic, and cultural, have become the pillars of accounting in this country. Our government's four capitals approach can be applied very usefully to tourism. So regenerative tourism, the post-COVID regenerative tourism paradigm, will build natural capital. It will be net zero carbon. It may give priority to Australian international visitors over our extreme long-haul visitors who bring a much higher carbon footprint. It will seek to engage visitors in the restoration of nature and New Zealand biodiversity. Perhaps tourism and tourist experiences will be integrated with our predator-free 2050 aspirations, the aspirations to eradicate predators across the country and build native biodiversity. It will protect and enhance our marine environments, and it will preserve wilderness and natural quiet. Within the community, regenerative tourism will build social capital by empowering and enriching local communities, providing health and well-being benefits. It will not exploit cheap labour. It will support local suppliers and support local jobs. It may indeed be integrated much more closely with civil defence to build community resilience. Regenerative tourism will build economic capital by providing local employment and opportunities of local ownership in tourism businesses. It will seek low levels of economic leakage from those communities. It will not neglect, as we have historically, the economic importance of domestic tourism, which has come back into focus with COVID. So it'll need to build regional economic resilience to global crises, because COVID will not be the last global crisis that we have to face. And regenerative tourism will build cultural capital. It will connect visitors to place. It will stimulate new ways of thinking and deliver authentic experiences that are largely determined by mana whenua, local indigenous communities. These are some of the key elements of the regenerative tourism paradigm. And as I say, they mirror the government's living standards framework. All four of these capitals will need to be measured and monitored in exactly the same way that we've paid attention to economic outcomes of tourism. All four of these capitals will need to be accounted for. So this is a framework that can be utilised and applied to optimising discrete markets, optimising the markets that we target based on their contributions to the four capitals. They can also be used for specific subsectors. I'll talk very briefly about the cruise sector, because this kind of leads me to a key conclusion point. There's a current debate in this country about reopening New Zealand's borders to international cruise ships. The cruise sector has taken a hammering, of course, under COVID. Initially as a hotbed of COVID transmission, we've seen images of ships stranded in ports like Yokohama, and then stranded in the open ocean, unwelcomed at any ports of disembarkation because of the COVID threat. This has prompted a more critical appraisal of the net benefits of cruise. Should our borders be reopened? Cruise New Zealand is urging that we need to reopen our borders to cruise. Is now the time, though, for a really critical discussion of the merits of cruise, perhaps under a regenerative tourism framework. So if we think about this framework, there are valid concerns regarding the carbon emissions of cruise. We know that cruise has a high carbon footprint. There are also doubts around practices in the open ocean, disposal of waste in the open ocean. Doubts also arise in terms of empowerment and labour issues when operating outside of national jurisdictions. So we need to think about these issues as well. The cruise economic model is not well understood, but we do know that cruise passengers in 2019 represented 9% of all of our international arrivals, but only 3% of international visitor spend in this country. So there are some really important questions to ask about the economics of cruise and leakage, and the extent to which cruise affords opportunities for local communities to express kaitiakitanga, guardianship, and manakitanga, the sense of hospitality and looking after our visitors. That also needs to be more critically considered. This slide, this image here is a fascinating one, immediately pre-COVID, taken in ports of Tauranga in the North Island, where Filipino staff from the cruise ship were imitating a local Maori traditional welcome for those cruise passengers. And this hit the headlines and once again gave portrayed a really terrible picture of a form of cruise tourism that detracts from rather than contributes cultural capital. So if, as Simon Upton suggests, local communities in Mana Whenua should have a leading voice in local tourism development, they should have a voice in the reopening to the cruise industry. Should we reopen for cruise? If so, when? That's a really important question. Should that be a return when it happens to business as usual? Or is now the time to discuss how cruise fits within a regenerative and aspirational future for sustainable tourism in this country? This is an interesting question. It's a very timely question, and it should inspire a wider debate amongst communities that ports have called for cruise ships in this country. So, what about a final word about the role of academics? I would argue that the role of academics has fundamentally changed. We need to be contributing to public debate. We need to be shaping the agenda and discussing, confronting and challenging issues. We should be publishing, but we should also be disseminating and working with media to bring these issues and research insights to wider public debate. We have to be working now more than ever closely with key agents of change, key actors within the tourism system. So we need to continue to conduct research that's timely and important, but we need to be advising ministers. We need to be working closely with policymakers. My experience of the last year or more is that policymakers are coming to the academic community looking for insights, looking for answers. We need to ensure that our research is informing policy. I'd like to finish with this quote. I started with a quote from Rod Oram, my good friend, and I'll finish with this quote. Rod was a speaker at our tourism policy school in Queenstown this year. He says, "What if we reinvented tourism so it becomes an activity that generates common wealth in all senses of the word, ecological and economic, social and cultural? These four capitals are the basis of the government's living standards framework. By enhancing these four capitals, tourism would increase its contribution to Aotearoa and encourage other sectors and other segments of society to also grow anew." I really like that quote. I just want to finish by saying that I began my presentation by suggesting that we really can't overstate the importance of this moment in time, at this fork in the road ahead of us. The window of opportunity is narrow and it will shut quickly. When the reopening begins, tourism will soon regather its irresistible momentum, that momentum that we saw in the lead up to COVID. Now is the time for action. It is a critical moment, and governments, businesses, industry organizations, local communities, and academics have to work together to rebuild a future-fit tourism system that will meet the challenges that we face in the 21st century. Thank you for your attention.
I'm going to pivot so I can actually see James on the screen. Apologies for my back to our audience. Thank you, James, for leaving us with that call to action, which I think is for everyone in the room that we can take forward going into the future. We will take time for questions. We have about probably about 10 minutes. I've got the yes over there. So I will open up firstly for a question in the room, and then we might go to the chat. Ryan, if there's a question in the room. Judith.
I'll ask one. James, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, James, it's Judith Mayer from UQ.
Hi, Judith.
Hello, nice to see you.
You too. I can't see you.
No. I love the idea of regenerative tourism. I can see the value in it. Can you give us some thoughts on how we can begin the process of basically dismantling what is a huge and very unwieldy industry in the sense that, you know, to make the changes that we would need to do, we're talking multinational corporations here.
Absolutely, great question. I mean, it's an enormous task, isn't it? And really, the question relates to where do we begin? I've mentioned that now is the moment, now is the time. Simon Upton is really clear about this as well. He argues that. Well, he acknowledges that tourism businesses have never faced such a critically challenging time, and that it could be argued that now is not the time to be making significant changes, but rather it should be a time for supporting the recovery of businesses. But he's made the point, and I think in this country there's widespread agreement that if we can't make changes now, then we're doomed. We never will be able to make changes without taking advantage of the current pause. Simon Upton's report is extremely timely. The Parliamentary Commissioner's Office is really influential, and his first report was immediately pre-COVID, and his second report with recommendations immediately pre-reopening the Trans-Tasman bubble in the first instance. So that has built momentum. I've already mentioned in this presentation that each year we host at Otago in Queenstown, to be precise, the annual Tourism Policy School. And this year in March, it's a March annual event. And this year we had a really forward-thinking gathering of government ministers, of key ministry public servants, policy makers, industry organisations, thought leaders from business, academic keynote speakers, including Susanna, who I've referred to in this presentation. And it was really fantastic to get everyone together in the room. It was a one-day meeting, preceded the day before by a public lecture, which was presented by Simon Upton. And I was really uplifted by the general consensus that this is a moment for action, and getting everyone together in the same room and getting that discussion flowing and hearing that sense of common cause was really quite powerful. The Minister of Tourism was there, presented the opening address. He was there to feel the vibe in the room, if you like. And I would also mention that within the room were people from outside of perhaps the tourism system as narrowly defined. So, the importance of getting Ministry of Transport and the New Zealand Transport Agency in the room, because a lot of our carbon footprint is locked in by transport infrastructures. So I'm sorry, I know we've got a shortage of time, but opening those conversations, engaging with media, engaging with the key actors in the tourism system, I think that has become a real pressing urgency from my own point of view and the view of many of my colleagues, over and above business as usual as far as academics are concerned.
Thank you, James. And I don't think we have that consensus yet here in this country, at least. Ryan, do you want to read out a question from our online audience?
Sure. So there's a Dr. Wegner from the University of the Bahamas. He says, for small island developing states like the Bahamas and many other countries in the Caribbean, they rely on tourism income as their biggest GDP contribution, and that income actually is needed for their well-being. So it's a very delicate state, and he asks, what do you think they should be doing?
Yeah, yeah. It's a. How long have we got? It's an enormous question, but it's actually a really good question. And the parallel that we have in this country is Queenstown in Central Otago, very tourism dependent. And the Minister of Tourism has just recently made an announcement that there will be funding provided to help support the recovery of tourism in Queenstown, but it will be with conditions. And the key condition that the Minister is imposing upon this funding is that Queenstown diversify its economy. And so, this high tourism dependence in the Queenstown economy is not sustainable. It's not resilient. It puts that community, as we've seen over the last 18 months, at enormous risk when there are global bioshocks. And the Minister of Tourism wants to see a diversification of Queenstown and wider Central Otago, Central Lakes economy. What form that will take is really interesting. And I've been involved in initial conversations about how that pathway may be negotiated. Tourism will still be really important. The visitor economy, no doubt, will still be really important. But there will be a move away from the tourism that we had before COVID, which has rendered that community and that economy so vulnerable. So it's really a question of watch this space. In the next 8 weeks or so, we are going to be hosting an event again in Queenstown to talk about economic diversification and what the future of tourism might hold for that region within the context of a much more diversified economy.
Time for one more very quick question in the room. Brent, no? Bob?
Hi, James. Bob McKercher from University of Queensland. Sustainability involves government policy, industry action, and consumer behavior. We did a study years ago that found that consumers rank tourism as their 40th most important environmental issue.
Yeah.
And we just concluded a study of Queensland residents, and 1% of them said environmental concerns played a role in their tourism decisions. So if we're going to change tourism, we've got to change consumer behavior. Simple question, how do we start that process?
Yeah. You guys are asking all the easy questions, eh? Great to hear your voice, Bob. Welcome back to Australia. That's another how long have you got question, isn't it? I think we're embarking on that pathway. What you say is absolutely correct. We need to harness the power of the tourist, and we need to find ways of bringing tourists to this country and engaging domestic tourists in the good cause. Not easy. My own research has echoed your sentiments. So many tourists see tourism as outside of their daily lives and outside of their daily concerns, including their climate and wider environmental concerns. So how do we harness tourists as agents of change? There's a bit of focus in this country around tourist values and values-based tourism. You may be aware of the Tiaki Pledge, which is a business-led initiative in this country that seeks to engage visitors in a pledge to behave and conduct themselves in this country in accordance with Indigenous perspectives on kaitiakitanga, or guardianship of nature, and that intergenerational perspective on places and environments and people. So one of our challenges, and Yayen and I have had some conversations around this, looks at how we profile markets, how we profile and seek to optimize markets, because ideally we want visitors coming to this country who are environmental stewards, who offset their unavoidable emissions, who travel with the lightest possible carbon footprint, who engage in activities that contribute social, cultural, and ecological capital, rather than that old tourism, as I've mentioned. That's a work in progress, and I guess it's a journey, not a destination. But I think that's certainly part of the aspiration.
Thank you, James. Well, James can't see us, but I'm sure he will be able to hear us when we give him a really, really big round of applause. To our online colleagues, please feel free to add your messages of thanks into the chat function. Thank you very much, James, for your time today. You were the perfect person to speak to that particular topic. We hope you stay safe and well in Otago, and we look forward to seeing you face to face very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate it.